quite 600,000, about 550,000. Sorry, excuse me. It's a little bit more than 500,000. But that is an enormous number. However, they are quite concentrated. When people talk about the settlements, I think they mix up terms a great deal. There are the settlers in Jerusalem, which constitute a very large group, and that has to be dealt with separately. And in the West Bank, the built-up areas of the settlements are about 2 to maybe 2.5% of the territory of the West Bank. The settlement blocks and the areas reserved for settlement expansion constitute 40% of the West Bank. Area C in general constitutes 60%. So if you talk about Israel annexing settlement blocks as a whole and contiguity there, then of course it is impossible to imagine a Palestinian state emerging under those conditions. However, that's not what the last round of serious Israeli-Palestinian negotiations on this subject was talking about. Ehud Olmert was talking about approximately 6.5 to 6.9% of the territory being involved in a land swap. President Abbas was proposing 1.9%. I think there are a number of models that have been developed which are quite plausible, which involve a land swap in which something like 80% of settlers can be retained under Israeli sovereignty in a two-state agreement, with a land swap of something manageable like 3% to 4% of the occupied territories. It does not require a sacrifice of huge, enormous tracts of land. Similarly, of course, it has always been understood that a two-state solution would involve a corridor between Gaza and the West Bank, etc. And all of this is necessary. Now, why would I sit here and say that a two-state solution is not dead, first of all? Well, it's not dead, first of all, because the metric that Reza is looking at is wrong. The metric is not the demographic and infrastructural and administrative changes, because those are the products of political will. And he emphasized that. He said it's deliberate, it's a policy, etc. Agreed. Okay, people did this and they did it for a reason. Fine. Anything that was done for political reasons can be undone for political reasons. And again, I point to the withdrawals in Gaza and the northern West Bank. Israel has a problem. What is it going to do with the Palestinian people? They're not going to go away. They can't be driven out. They can't be incorporated into Israel. And so you can stretch out the status quo for quite a long time, but in the end, there has to be a solution that's acceptable to the Israelis, or some vision that they have. And so far, the majority of Israelis are determined, I think they're very rather strongly in favor of a two-state solution. The majority of Palestinians are in favor of a two-state solution. So it's a question of political will. If you can come to me and demonstrate to me that a very large number of Israelis and a majority of Palestinians don't want a two-state solution or don't think it can happen and are convinced that it's a bad idea for an extended period of time, then I would agree with you that we can give up on it, because we won't have the political will to reverse some of those demographic and infrastructural changes in the occupied territories to create a Palestinian state, and we'll have to look at creative options like this confederation, but we're nowhere near that point. Now, you can say that the international community is pretending all you like, but as a matter of fact, there is a gigantic body, and this is very important from a Palestinian point of view, a gigantic body of international law that supports a two-state solution, beginning with, I suppose, in a way, the Partition Resolution of 47, but certainly with Security Council Resolution 242 in 1967, which anticipates the two-state solution really in the long run, since ultimately Jordan came to the conclusion it didn't want to be in possession of these territories either. Neither will Egypt accept possession of Gaza. So the question is ultimately, what are you going to do? And I think there are really only two outcomes that can be produced by the forces that produce outcomes in this situation. We can either have a two-state solution, which is still achievable practically, legally, politically, etc. It's still achievable because it's in everybody's interests. I mean, you say it's not, that you say it's weird. You say on the one hand that you don't think it's the best solution, and then in the end you say good riddance to it. I don't really know what you feel about this, but I would say honestly that it's essential that you've got to have a kind of grounding in what can be accomplished here. And I just don't see how this confederation of yours can come about. I don't see why it would be in Israel's interest to opt for this confederation. It seems to me that everything that militates towards that confederation militates more towards a two-state solution. And I think that you didn't, I'm glad you didn't go to the South Africa model, because that again militates towards a two-state solution. But every right-wing Israeli leader who has moved away from support from the extreme settlers and towards an interest in dealing with the Palestinians has done so for the very reason you cited, which is the demographic question. And the demographic question is getting worse and worse. And so clearly, what you could have is a continuation of the status quo, which will mean more conflict, further intifadas, and I think we're not that far from another one, frankly, and a continuation of violence and conflict and what have you. As far as I'm concerned, to say good riddance to the only way of avoiding that is irresponsible. We could also have a two-state solution because it is still in the Israeli national interest to do it, and most Israelis think that. Because it is in the Palestinian national interest to do it, and most Palestinians think that. Because it is in the American national interest, and the United States says that, and they're not lying, they mean it. I mean, I've dealt with the government enough that I don't think that the Obama administration, for all of its missteps, was insincere. I think that they made some serious missteps, but I think it really is American policy to want to have a Palestinian state, and I think that's been evident from many different policies. If you want me to enumerate them, I'll be happy to. But I think it's pretty clear they do. The Arabs certainly want a two-state solution. They've made that abundantly clear through the Arab Peace Initiative and through their own policies. They're done with this business of an open-ended war with Israel. They've been done with it since the late 70s. For most Arab states, the Palestinians are a very disturbing variable, which would be better if it were resolved. And the international community, as I say, is heavily on record in favor of this. And you can say it's all pretense if you like, but the fact is this is grounded in very strong national interests on all sides and very strong legal bases, and a very strong imperative for most of the actors that exist. Now, the truth is, we have collectively, and I think you're right in singling out the settlement movement as the single biggest villain, and of course, Hamas and extremists among the Arabs get their share of the blame as well, and along with everybody else, but we have really allowed extremists to kind of have a veto over the wills of majorities that I've explicated before, and it is quite within the realm of possibility to remove those vetoes through political will, through acts of political will. Walls come up and walls come down, as I say. Now, certainly the other possibility is for endless conflict. Let me end by saying, anyone who advocates for a single state should face the fact that we have one. This isn't something we would posit as a plausible outcome in the future. You've got it. It exists. My question to you is, do you like it? Because this is what you're going to get. I mean, I don't see how you say, well, the project of persuading or compelling or cajoling Israel to end the occupation is so difficult that what we're going to do to correct that is to move to a much simpler project, which is to get or persuade or cajole Israel to essentially dismantle itself. I mean, I find it absurd to say that abandoning a very difficult problem, the achievement of which I agree is going to be extremely hard, in favor of an infinitely more difficult problem that is going to be generational and going to take decades and probably going to take an enormous amount of bloodshed, is an unbelievably irresponsible and unrealistic approach. And let me simply note this. In any one-state solution worthy of its name would mean that both parties, or one of the two parties at least, gives up on their fundamental national identity, their fundamental national dream. You really couldn't have a single state in which both national projects are seriously realized. Look at the amount of bloodshed since 1948 that the Palestinians and the Israelis have experienced, each of them. And look how much it has dented their fervor, each of their fervor for their national project. Not much. And I really want to ask you to imagine how much bloodshed it would require to dent it enough to have them share it or give it away or give it up. I don't think that can happen. I think the only way out of this cycle of violence is a two-state agreement, and that a two-state agreement is still certainly possible because it is a political question, not ultimately a question of infrastructure, demography, and other actions on the part of, say, for instance, the Israelis or Hamas or anybody else that are political decisions. If Israeli society, and Zvika Krieger wrote a very good article about this the other day in The Atlantic, arguing, and I think very persuasively, that if the Israeli government decided that it had to evacuate 100 or 150,000 settlers, that they would do it in their national interests, and that the settlers, most of them ultimately would go willingly, and the rest would be brought along. And I think that to abandon the only way out of this conflict is both short-sighted and terribly unrealistic, and borders on science fiction.